told to stand in the middle of this arena, which is a little bit like being in a boxing ring, so I hope you'll forgive me if I sometimes turn left and right in case I have to absorb a blow. But let me first of all thank the Business for Peace Foundation for both being such a courageous and engaging partner in this idea that the Sustainable Development Goals, investment and finance are topics of our time, and not topics that happen on opposite ends of the spectrum of how our economies function, namely government on one side and business entrepreneurship on the other side, but in fact, in an era where the leveraging of one another is in fact the only hope we have for being able to address the challenge of financing transitions and transformations that are both unprecedented in terms of magnitude, scale, but also in terms of time. Facing that challenge is what led the world in 2015 to adopt the Sustainable Development Goals, and remarkable as it may seem, only 3 years later, we seem to be drifting apart as a world, and the role of business, perhaps counterintuitively, becomes more central to actually enabling the world to still not only maintain confidence in the ability to meet those Sustainable Development Goals, but more importantly, to actually power these transitions. You would not be in this room here if you are not familiar with all the reasons why these transformations need to happen. So I will not take your time to talk about climate change, about the risks of inequality, about the emergence of a digital economy that could be highly inclusive and central to poverty eradication, or could leave a world even more unequal, and above all, with too many people feeling that there is no equity in access to what this modern world offers us. We are 7 billion people today. We will be 9 to 10 billion people somewhere in the second half of this century. We have parts of the world that are as wealthy as ever and unimaginably rich. We live in a world where the wealth is estimated to be over $300 trillion. And yet we live in a world where just south of Europe, there is a continent where 600 million people don't have access to electricity in the year 2019, where a population is growing on the African continent that will somewhere in the second half of this century surpass 2 billion people. So the market opportunity, never mind the imperative of providing access to energy to roughly 1.4 billion people over the next 30 to 40 years, is without precedent in human history. Not even China over the last 30 years comes close to this. The Commission on Business and Sustainable Development issued a report in which it said that, the market opportunities in the sustainable development transitions could be estimated around 12 trillion a year. So we don't really need to debate the logic of business investing in that economy. What we need to face and confront, and that is where finance becomes so central, how do we move from having science, policy, strategic thinking, think tanks, those who do foresight reports, talking about a 21st century economy that needs to be low carbon, more inclusive, and I will not mention all the attributes that the SDGs define, and an economy, and particularly a financial sector, that is still invested in a 20th century economy, where it is so much easier to fund the next coal-fired power station just because you know that it has been done before, than investing in a wind power farm, in hydrogen energy sources, in energy efficiency. We need your support, and UNDP, the United Nations Development Programme, which is an organization that literally straddles the whole planet. We operate in 170 countries. We have 17,000 people who work alongside government and partners in actually helping them to identify how to accelerate the transition to more sustainable development, how to deal with poverty eradication, contain the risks of pandemics, but also build the kind of skills in the next generation that can thrive in the digital economy, that can make artificial intelligence work for them rather than just being another data set. It is into this context that we also embrace the responsibility that we need to help governments answer the question, how on earth are we going to mobilize the kind of finance we need for these transitions? We are literally reinventing our economies over the next 2 to 3 decades. It's massive investments. But, some people say we can't afford to do it. Well, the first departure point is very simple. It's not about extra money. It's about investing money in either the economy of yesterday or the economy of tomorrow. And it's the same money. And it's part of that $300 trillion wealth base that we can draw on. Secondly, it is also to find new ways of investing and looking at how regulatory, fiscal, policy instruments can be aligned in such a way that investing in those future technologies, services, infrastructure, actually becomes something that is not distorted by externalities not being taxed, but also by incentivizing those who have the ability to invest. We can continue talking about the essential role that private capital has to play. But for us in UNDP, who every day in these 170 countries have to work on the coal face, a strange analogy perhaps to use on my part, is to actually make it happen. We cannot just continue to talk in the abstract. And therefore, we embrace this challenge by engaging in a conversation with key players in the financial sector in order to better understand what could an organization such as the United Nations Development Programme bring to this equation of leveraging private finance, financial markets in a domestic economic context to invest in ways that are aligned with achieving the SDGs. And this is not charity, it is about access to energy, it's access to healthcare, it's about income opportunities, training, investment in education, all things that pay returns. But they're not happening because the financial system has extraordinary inertia, because the policy signals that our governments provide to this transition are conflicting and contradictory, and sometimes reward us to stay with yesterday's economy rather than tomorrow's. The International Monetary Fund, and credit to Christine Lagarde, just published a report 2 weeks ago that estimates that the subsidies for fossil fuels in the year 2017 amounted to $5.2 trillion. How on earth is a cleaner energy economy ever going to win the investors over when that is how cards are stacked? So us working together from public policy to the private sector to the financial markets is central to what we want to achieve. SDG Impact, which you will hear a lot more about, and I'm so grateful to those who are, let's say, risk takers, pioneers, and willing partners in leading you into a vision where we stop talking about the need to invest differently, we start doing it. SDG Impact is about better measurement, because we still struggle to actually measure how impact works and how we should go about measuring it. The Impact Management Project and the partnership with Sir Ronnie Cohen and many others has been part of this consortium that we have been working with. Secondly, information and data. And thirdly, we also need to address the issue of facilitation. So investor maps, building on that presence that we have in countries, to connect those economies that on the radar of the global highway of finance simply do not appear, are at the center of SDG Impact. You will hear this afternoon how we are beginning to build this fast, significant, and above all, aligning finance with the future of the development pathway that we all wish to go. Thank you very much, and have an excellent discussion this afternoon.
Achim, thank you very much. And here is your seat. So it's not a question of if, it's a question of how. And I think the relevant question is, are you investing in the past or are you investing in the future? And I think that's a great segue to the panel. So Achim, please take a seat. I'd now like to welcome the rest of the panel onto the stage. We have the Secretary General of the ICC, Mr. John Denton. And we have the Chief of Global Operations for the UN Global Compact, Ole Lund Hansen. And last but not least, we have the CEO of the Principles for Responsible Investment, Fiona Reynolds. Now, Fiona, you were last to come onto the stage, but I'd like to direct the first question to you. You're the CEO of a membership organization that has almost 2,400 signatories with $86 trillion assets under management, so quite a formidable force. Why do these investors and asset managers need the SDG Impact Initiative? What difference do you think it will make?
Well, I think, first of all, when we think from the investment perspective, every investment that an investor makes has some form of impact. That impact might be negative and it might be positive. And when we think about the SDGs, they give a really great framework for investors to think about both what are the risks to my investments and my engagements with companies, but also what are the opportunities. So you can see it through both lenses. But when you're an investor, you work in a particular world and you need data, you need standards, you need benchmarks, you need all of the market mechanisms in place to be able to do the work that you that you work. It's just the way finance and investment works. And I think one of the things that the SDG Impact work does is going to develop all of those standards. And that means that we will be able to mobilise capital. We have a lot of our signatories who are really interested in the SDGs. They're interested in how they can invest and in sustainable development investing, but they don't have all of those mechanisms. So I think it's really important, which is why we've been working with all the other groups on how you develop the impact management tools and how you can actually measure your impact, as Achim was talking about. We don't really know that in a very systematic way. So that's why I think these things are important for investors.
Have your members been bugging you about doing something like this? Is this something that they're asking for?
So the SDGs are really important to a whole lot of our signatories, and yes, they're grappling with how do I really invest in the SDGs? What can I do? And on both the active ownership side, so engaging with business, but also on the actual investment side.
Right, because it's not only about what you invest in, but it's also about how you engage with your investments, right?
The active ownership is really important. We need to engage with business. We need to signal that sustainability is important. We need to stand behind business as they make, transformation as well. It's a large part of the role that we play at the PRI is working with a lot of our signatories in collaborative engagements with business on a whole range of sustainability issues.
I think that's a nice segue over to you, Ole, because of course you're a membership organisation as well, around 10,000 companies across the world. They've committed to your 10 principles. They're committing to reporting on progress. And now there's the SDG Impact Initiative. And I think last time I heard somebody count, there was something like 112 different initiatives out there trying to measure and map impact. And I'm wondering, doing this, what will this mean for your membership companies? Will it make their lives easier or more difficult?
I definitely think it'll make it easier. But of course, a lot of that remains to be seen as we, are only, starting to support this project and work with Achim and the team to really get this, I think, what is in itself a very ambitious impact venture really off the ground. But I think what is undisputed is the fact that there is a really large and growing demand by both investors and companies for tools and for standards that can help them really measure, monitor, and manage the impacts that they have. So yeah, definitely there are other tools out there. We've launched recently with PwC, but also in work with PRI, certain tools focusing specifically on reporting and reporting aligned with the SDGs. And they remain among the most popular tools that we really have on our website with thousands of downloads, really. Yeah. So I think this goes to say that there is still a real need and a real demand, and I think none of the initiatives that either of us represent can really say that we've solved this problem yet. So we're still in a phase of experimentation and innovation, and I think we need all the ideas and all the initiatives really that can focus on this.
So we're all looking for the Holy Grail, and maybe this is it. Who knows?
Exactly.
John, you're also a membership organisation. I think part of the compelling picture here is that you are representing so many organisations with such large revenues and also so many assets under management. And I wanted to hear from you, what do you think your members might be able to achieve with this? What would you ideally like to see change with your members in more than 100 countries if we then get this SDG impact off the ground and into practice?
I'm going to sound like the heretic in the room, I'm afraid. And maybe it's not a bad place to be in a Nordic country to be a heretic.
I think that's a very good place to start.
Not a bad place to start. First of all, yes, we have members, but actually the International Chamber of Commerce is an institution. We were founded 100 years ago on a belief, which still consists today, that business can be and must be a force for peace, prosperity and opportunity for all. That's actually our ethos. And people align with that. And the reason I say that is that we are actually not owned by members. We stand for these things and people align themselves with that. We have chosen to take a prominent role in aligning our institution with the Sustainable Development Goals. And we have done the same thing with the Paris Agreement. The reason I say that as an institution we can do that, because there are many businesses who do not want to align with aspects of the SDGs, who do not want to align with Paris, in fact actively fight against both of these issues. They can have their views, but we're an institution, we stand for these things.
Is that difficult to stand for a view where you have some members who might not align with that view? How do you cope with that?
Absolutely, because what normally happens in organisations is that you then are reduced to a compromise or reduced to the consensus. My job is to build a consensus in line with our values and our purpose. So I'm building a consensus and actually building coalitions which actually enable us to deliver on our purpose, and a particular element for us in delivering on peace, prosperity and opportunity for all is alignment and execution against the SDGs. So
and what role can then the SDG Impact play, do you think, in that space?
Well, I mean, what I like about it is the fact that, first of all, Achim is taking UNDP and is shaking it up. I actually think this is a tremendous organisation, but like any institution, it needs to allow, if I can, the spirit of modernity to flow through it. The way in which you're articulating a future for the UNDP is in many respects the way in which we've reimagined the role of the ICC. And we like to align ourselves with strange and unusual coalitions. And so in a funny way, a business organisation spending a lot of time with the UN is kind of like, oh my God, get me out of this meeting. But actually, if you can get the right people in the UN, partnering and understanding the interests of the private sector can be aligned if we can focus on these underlying values, then you can achieve real stuff. And that's what I'm really focused on at the moment. And we actually have within our network, supporting our institution, 45 million businesses. Curiously, we are developing, we are the whole world. So we actually have very big business networks in Africa, developing countries. The interesting thing there is we're big and small. So we have SMEs and micro SMEs who are part of it. My job is to enable those businesses to prosper. The hypothesis we have, and again, we're looking for the results, but the hypothesis that we're betting our reputation on is if you apply the SDGs or make sense of the SDGs in your business, is a better way of putting it, you can actually build a stronger business. The benefit of that will then be, we should be able to find some positive outcome for that, which is more than just feeling good. For an SME and a micro SME, if you can show that you've actually aligned yourselves with the SDGs and you therefore have a more robust business, then why can't you attract capital at a lower rate?
So if I can just build on that for a moment and maybe be, like you, a bit of a heretic in this context. If you're working with companies in developing markets, some of the least developed countries in the world, they may be SMEs, and then we are here talking about a framework with data, standards, benchmarks. Might it not be terribly challenging for those companies to live up to, you know, a kind of Norwegian or Western model of reporting on SDGs?
Yeah, so one of my jobs is to make sense of the SDGs for the business world. Another way of putting it is that I can tell you, if you're running a small fish wrangling store out of Dhaka in Bangladesh, you have no idea of the 17 SDGs. But do you want to have cleaner water? Do you want people around you to live in poverty? Do you actually want to pollute? No. I mean, there's essence there. So making sense of it for people so they can live a real life. But by one other thing, what they don't want and what is driving everyone crazy in the real business world is the reporting stuff. This is for SMEs and micro SMEs. They don't want to report. It's another burden. Often there's one person, they don't have access to the forms, they can't understand the forms, and the idea of the reporting, what we're trying to do is help people align, which is a more effective thing.
So this is one of the challenges or opportunities even going forward for the SDG Impact, right, to ensure that we don't end up in that situation for those small companies. Achim, turning to you, I think I'd like to first build on something that John said about you shaking up the UNDP. Do you feel like that's what you're doing?
Well, this is the delusion.
I'm a fan.
I think you have support for doing so, but yeah.
Well, I wish it was true. It's probably more the institution shaking me up, but I think either way, it's a good relationship right now. And yes, I think every institution has to reinvent itself. And funnily enough, in the public sector, it's just as relevant as it is in the private sector. And I have been given this extraordinary opportunity to lead, in the business where we would say this is a $5.5 billion organization, right? It has a market of literally 170 countries. We have a portfolio of 4,800 projects across the main areas of the global economic transformation. Why would I not want to make this institution, in a sense, reach to the future of development, which is basically the opportunity to help countries make things happen? And that's the process we're in, yeah.
And going back to the SDG Impact Initiative a little bit, why the UNDP? Why are you the right midwife, so to speak, for this initiative?
I don't think there's anything that makes UNDP necessarily the right midwife, but like so often in the world, ideas need champions, and sometimes your capacity to champion a new idea builds on your strength. And, UNDP is every day sitting in these capitals with governments, finance ministers, development ministers, planning ministers, cabinets, asking the question, how on earth can we mobilize this financial resource that we need? And the larger economies of the world are already attracting, as I said, from the financial highway of the world, more and more investment capital. We are particularly keen to look at the 90 to 100 developing countries that at the moment simply wouldn't register on any Richter scale of being an interesting investment market. And here we go back to the fundamentals. Leaving no one behind isn't just a moral appeal. The United Nations, the Sustainable Development Goals, that 2030 agenda, is an agenda for prevention. So if we leave billions of people behind, we know what's going to happen. We can see it already unfolding before our very eyes. So for the development program of the United Nations to step in and say, well, look, if we have this capacity, these platforms, then surely we need to be able to learn on how to relate to those who actually are decision makers in the financial world. And we deliberately called, Elizabeth is here, who has led that work within UNDP over the last year. We essentially created a startup. We deliberately said we don't know what to do, but we know we need to do something. And if somebody else comes along with a better idea, excellent. Right now, we have been privileged to also do something that the UN is very good at, which is to federate efforts. I mentioned IMP, and there are many other platforms and actors in the financial sector that are actually working on it. We are sitting with some of our colleagues here on the podium. And I think it is that moment where you have to exercise leadership. Everybody else can wait for everybody else to do something. UNDP really has no excuse to look for somebody bigger to do something better. Either we're part of that solution, and we have done what in business you consider to be a regular feature, which is to take a risk. And that's where we are.
What we're seeing, of course, also is, and I can see this from a Norfund perspective as a development finance institution, capital is not flowing to where capital is needed, right? In our part of the world, we have huge amounts of capital, but we're in fact seeing FDI inflows to the least developed countries declining, even after 2015. So how can the SDG Impact Initiative, how can that help redirect capital flows, would you say?
Well, in two ways. First of all, the interesting thing is because people also say, are you not just deluding yourself, that this money is waiting to do something? Well, ask key players in the financial sector. Their own demand from those people who put their money with these institutions are pushing for them to get into a space that is more than just a rate of return on investment. Not necessarily the big institutional investors, but there are trillions that are not coming only out of pension funds. So that push is there on the one hand. Secondly, we live in a time which is bizarre. You actually in Switzerland have to pay for your money to be held by a bank. So this is the moment in time in which you can actually make a transition where you don't have to extract with pliers money from one economy to another, because it's all over the place looking for places to invest. It's the transparency, the information, the ability, as you also put it, Fiona, to measure where we're getting stuck. So there is actually a demand. There is lots of money looking for this opportunity. There are billions of investment opportunities looking for the money, and yet they're not connecting. This has been, in some ways, the sustainable finance conundrum for the better part of a decade and a half. We believe that times have changed, and if we can bring that measurement standard together with also an information and data quantum leap forward, and then use a platform such as UNDP, but not in an exclusive sense, and with many partners that in part are sitting around this table here, but also in the private sector, create the kind of investment maps where a country that normally wouldn't even be on the map of global investment appears suddenly as, here is an opportunity, 100 million people, renewable energy, why wouldn't you want to invest in this? We can change the way I think investment flows will happen, and above all, we can change in a way that doesn't just go to where it's easy to make money now and leaves millions behind, but actually to attract that money to where people really need it.
Exactly, to where the real potential for development and impact is.
But the other thing that you're saying is really, 2030 is not very far away. More of the same is not going to get us there. We're actually playing at ICC to win. We're actually launching initiatives, some of which will work, some of which will not work, to shift things. We just launched, I want to point this out, we just launched a major, and the first organisation, a major blockchain initiative out of my Singapore office to ensure that blockchain technology can be made available and democratised and accessible by SMEs and micro-SMEs in developing countries. We're doing that so they can participate in a positive way in supply chain disciplines, and that'll be around traceability and sustainability.
And this is all about today's theme, right? How do we navigate in a world of imbalances? And I think that's a nice way to move into closing mode. I've warned the speakers that they get to give one statement, not a closing minute, but one single thing that you personally will do in order to make this happen. And we'll kick off with you, Fiona.
Well, we said when we, at the PRI, a year and a half ago, we created a blueprint for the next 10 years. And we said we wanted to create responsible investors working in sustainable markets.
One sentence from you personally.
Yep. And that we were going to create a more sustainable world for all. For me, it is about providing our signatories, and this is me personally as the CEO, with the tools to be able to do that, because there's lots of roadblocks in the way at the moment. And that's why I think all of us working together can solve this problem.
Great. John, one thing that you personally will do to make this happen?
Well, I'm going to use every bully pulpit opportunity I have to call it out for what it is and to demand more action.
Our man, the heretic. I'm delighted. Ola, what will you do personally?
I would say that what is great about this initiative and, the discussion we're having here is that we, acknowledge the big role that the real economy companies have. And that's obviously where we focus in the UN Global Compact.
But what will
so
you do?
One important new thing that we, and I guess, will do is really engaging CFOs and their corporate finance teams as the future champions of sustainability. They haven't been that in the past, generally speaking, but we need them to really understand the return on investment and to fix that link between corporates and investors on sustainability and the SDGs.
The CFOs as the new champions. Achim, one thing that you personally will do to make this happen?
I think I've begun it, and I've begun it with my colleagues, which is to put our reputation on the line and to find the allies, Anna Riot is here, John Denton and others, to actually lead by example. I think our world needs people to step up to it, and I think it's everyone's opportunity, everyone's responsibility. So here I am, sometimes sitting in a forum where people say, how on earth does he even know what to talk about when it comes to finance? And I say, actually, we have a lot to talk about together. And that's, I think, how things change.
So, ladies and gentlemen, keep shaking it up. And join me in thanking Achim, Ola, John, and Fiona, both for their reflections, but also for what they will be doing going forward. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Ola, good to see you.
Yeah.
Always good to see you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks. Next, we will turn to some of the practitioners. And first out is Anna Riot. She has a background both from Swedfund, the Swedish DFI, Development Finance Institution, and she's now the board chair of Summa Equity. Anna, please.
Thank you.
Now, Anna, I know that you've been in this space for a long time. You were in Addis in 2015, so 2015 was the year of the SDGs, the Paris Agreement, but also the meeting in Addis on finance for development. What's happened since, and how happy are you about what's happened?
So when I was in Addis, it was interesting because so the conference in Addis was actually the conference where we talk about how are we going to finance the SDGs. And I think everyone was very, very agreed that we need to really involve the private sector, the finance sector, but the problem were that first, no one from the private sector nearly were there. So we talked about the private sector instead of talking with the private sector. And the other thing that was quite obvious was that going out for the conference, quite few banks and businesses were willing to commit. And from 2015 until now, that has truly changed, and particularly the last year, I will say, that today we see maybe too many initiatives on how to align with the SDGs, how to drive capital towards the SDGs. And a lot of companies, banks, actor organizations are willing to commit.
And how much of this is real change and how much of this is rainbow washing?
So I think
rainbow washing with the SDGs and all the colors of the rainbow.
I actually think that from 2015, where there were a lot of talk about it, to today, it's more about more and more companies actually acting and putting their mouth where the money is. So we could see a huge change in some equity when we fundraised 3 years ago, where a lot of investors were not so eager to commit, and particularly when we talked about the mega trend, like resource efficiency, change in demographic, that they will have underlying high growth. Then the investors were like, yeah, that makes sense.
But in fact, you didn't really talk about the SDGs with investors, did you? Because you didn't want to kind of do the
we did, but we didn't use the word impact.
No.
Because when we did, we figured out that many investors were afraid, and they thought that impact meant less return. And I believe if we want to drive change fast, then we need to show that return goes hand in hand with also impact. So it's really a way of driving return by investing in future-proof companies and companies that can solve global challenges.
And another thing that's happened since 2015 is, as we alluded to in the earlier conversation, that capital flows to Africa are stagnant or maybe even declining. So in one way you can say the world promises to finance sustainable development, but the countries that need it the most, they're not getting any of the money. No. Is that a fair way of describing it?
It's actually a quite fair way of describing it, and it's a depressing figure. Just imagine this, that just 1% of the global capital is needed to finance the Sustainable Development Goals for Africa. But on the other hand, 1% of the VC capital of the world is going to Africa. So we don't see the money flowing into the countries that really need it. And I don't see so many actors, either from the aid organizations or DFIs or the private sector, really focusing on the entrepreneurs or the smaller companies in Africa, where a lot of growth will come from. So we need to use the system and all these new initiatives, and I think that's one reason of what I really like with SDG Impact, that they can give us, the business sector, the finance sector, show where are the gaps and where are the business opportunity, and that will make money also change, hopefully, to more to Africa.
How can SDG Impact do that? How can it enable money to flow where money is needed, so to speak?
So I think there are different parts of SDG Impact. The first one, of course, is finding a common framework, a common language to measure. And what I am really humble and excited about with SDG Impact is that it's not ready. It's not a toolbox ready saying, you, business, finance, you should use these tools. It's really welcoming us from the business sector to develop the measurements, the principles together. And I think that's fantastic. That will help to drive change, because if you understand the things that entrepreneurs are struggling with every day, you can also understand that some of these standards that we are creating are just too complicated to drive change. So that's one thing. And the other thing is to again, really showing UNDP has so much knowledge of what's happening in different countries and can really give us the understanding, the facts, the figures, the numbers that can drive change and wanted us to invest in these countries.
Important market intelligence, and then the box is yet to be filled. The tools are yet to be developed by people like yourself. So, Anna, thank you so much.
Thank you.
We'll continue with the practitioners, and I'll welcome some more speakers up on stage. One is a colleague of Anna's. It's Rainer Indahl, who is the managing partner of Summa Equity. It's Jan Erik Saugestad, who is the CEO of Storebrand Asset Management. Christian Sinding, CEO and Managing Partner of EQT. And last but not least, my former boss, Sverre Thorne, CEO of KLP. I like the music. It feels like we should be drinking something. And not just water, huh? Yeah. Now, you all represent institutions who are engaged or somehow supporting the SDG Impact. And I'd like us to talk a little bit about some of the implications and opportunities of doing something like this. And Sverre, maybe we can start with you. Where do you see the potential in an initiative like the SDG Impact, and what kind of difference do you think it might make for an organization like KLP?
From a practical point of view, we have high ambitions in this area, but it's hard to describe the things that is outside the financial return and risk. So if we could get a common and consistent approach to how we should define and measure impact, that would be very, very helpful. It would make it possible for us to tell people about the ambitions we have, and also to set more specific and concrete targets and report on it. So that will be very, very well helpful. When we did the partnership with Norfund, as you know, it was because they had the local expertise, they had the same view on governance, and they had deal flow. And this is part of the ambition of the initiative as well. It's quite possible that the UN could be a platform for this.
Great. And is there also an element here of, because I know KLP has been in this space for a long time, that it feels in some way maybe unfair that lots of institutions are branding themselves with the SDGs, but not necessarily doing things in practice? Is that a challenge?
I don't think so, actually. I mean, they will struggle with their stories, and we will try to find the best investments to bring the world forward.
Yeah. Jan Erik, what role do you see an initiative like this playing for Storebrand, one of the pioneers in the sustainable investment space?
Well, I think sustainable investment is on a journey, and it's been on a journey for a while. Initiatives like these and the 119 others.
Because there are something like 120 initiatives out there, right?
That's what I heard from the previous speakers.
Yeah.
Anyway, I think they're very valuable, this one as well, because for one thing, it sort of educates and brings information to companies and other investors that are not yet engaged, creating more solutions and more innovative ideas to sort of invest in. So that's one thing. The other is, of course, bringing more information and a framework to assess companies, help us assess, how would these companies look if we're successful in achieving the SDGs. Are they really businesses we want to invest in? Are they part of the solutions or not? And thirdly, of course, coming back to your color washing or rainbow washing, of course, some kind of measurement of the quality of what they're delivering, any portfolio is delivering. We've done that in financial returns. Why not in impact returns?
Yeah. Christian, coming from the private equity space, if you look at the private equity value chain, so to speak, from your designing your strategy, sourcing, due diligence, ownership, and then exit, where do you see the most significant potential to generate impact?
We actually see it across the value chain. And one of the elements we've been thinking a lot about is how do we actually simplify? Because like you said, there are 120 different initiatives out there. There are a lot of different reporting methodologies. We have 500 LPs, 500 investors across the world in EQT, and almost all of them want their own bespoke reporting regarding sustainability. So what we're thinking about is how do we simplify all these initiatives? And what we've done is try to create a simple matrix. On the one hand, where is the company that we're looking at? Where is that in terms of sustainability today? And is that an acceptable place to be? Can we invest in that? And then we think about what are the value creation levers we can work with to take that company from where it is today to somewhere else. And then we've been looking for, what kind of framework can we use to make that sharper, smarter, better, and more understandable for everybody. And then we're starting now to really use the SDGs for both of those, both on finding the companies and placing them in the matrix, and on driving the value creation plans.
Yeah. Rainer, does this resonate with how you think in Summa? If you think about the investment value chain and where you think you can drive the most impact and maybe even generate the most value, financial value from sustainability and impact?
So investors invest in private equity because they believe the asset class is giving superior returns to public equities. So I compete with Summa in a market where we are trying to raise capital from some of the larger LPs, similar to EQT. And if I'm thinking, how can I create returns in the world we're living in? It is we've never had this much volatility and risk as we have now. Then I have to start thinking about what should I invest in? So where should I focus? I can't look at every company. And then I have to, when we own them, we own the majority control of them, have to drive the value in these companies. So if I'm going to be the best investor, I have to think, where should I focus? And how do I see something differently in that business? And how can I create value, which other investors don't see? And then I think the SDG framework is a fantastic framework for doing that, because they are 17 problem definitions. So our challenges are our biggest investment opportunities. Here we are presented with these 17 challenges that have to be solved. It's businesses that have to solve it. So if we can find the winners in the Nordic, we invest in the Nordic, that actually have solutions to some of these problems in health, in recycling, in aquaculture, then we can be much more targeted looking for those companies. And our mission is to invest to solve global challenges. So of course, when we come to those companies, they want us as owners. And then we make a strategy plan with them. How can they solve that problem even better? So we have a value creation approach that I think other investors are not seeing. And luckily, we don't compete with EQT. We were smaller because they're doing exactly the same. So
we take inspiration from each other. So that's good. Yeah.
And you're then looking at business models and how sustainable they are and how you can drive value from building those types of models. But if we then revert back to SDG Impact for a moment, and that's about creating standards and measures, trying to understand how impactful a particular company is there any risk that you'll end up being, looking too much at the reporting and measuring side and not really enough at the business model and the actual investment? How do we get that balance right?
Yeah, I do think there is a lot of confusion out there, and that is definitely a risk. What we have done, and you can download our report on the web, we make it very simple. So we have the targets that are linked to the core of the business. If you're a recycling company, how much do you actually recycle? What is material recycling? If you're a healthcare company, how does the patient outcome and improvement really be? So, and those you can link to the sub-goals in the SDGs. So make it simple and tie it to the core of the business instead of greenwashing or rainbow washing or whatever you introduced.
But then if I can challenge that a little, if you tie it to the core of the business, how will it then be possible to create a global standard for how to measure impact?
So
because even in your portfolio, you'll have very different measures for your aquaculture company and your health company and your recycling company, right?
Yeah. So it has to be specific to that business and that industry. So, waste and recycling company doesn't improve all 17 goals. So find the 3, which is 11, 12, and 13, that is actually improved by the business. So don't try to measure everything. That's our philosophy. And it has to be able to, they can have a discussion with management about what is the strategy plan. So this is the problem you're solving. How are you going to solve it better in 5 years' time? And then you can't solve every problem. So you have to be focused. And that's where I think it's very easy with the SDGs. Find what's relevant. And of course, if we report on something on our companies that isn't really that relevant, people are going to see it. So we have the narrative also around.
The relevance is the key. And if I take the Norfund perspective for a moment, where we are coming from, we're saying, where can we have the highest development effects and the highest impact? And our way of doing that is selecting geographies, markets, and then selecting sectors where we see a great potential for job creation and improving lives, but really doing that at the investment strategy level in some of the markets in the world that are the most challenging and that, where capital is very scarce. And then the question is, because in many of these markets, they don't know about the SDGs, they don't report, they don't have standards. So if we're trying to develop a global standard to apply to all companies in all markets, is there a risk that we'll be channeling capital to the types of companies that EQT and Summa are investing in the Nordics, but that an SME in Niger will be suffering?
I think so. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I think that's one of the dilemmas. I think the whole conference has been about imbalances. And I think we have to understand that we have vast resources in almost all respects in the developed world, while those who would benefit the most from our investments are in the part of the world that would be hit hardest by climate change among all the other topics. And that's the biggest challenge. How do we channel more of our investments into these countries where we are so unsure about so many things, and where we don't have a good risk perception either, because we haven't invested there before. So we think everything is very dangerous there. While 2008, reminded us that we didn't understand risk in our world either. So it's to overcome this, and then we have to rely on the knowledge that has been built up by institutions like the UN, where the world comes together and say, these are the targets we should try to solve, or the targets we should have.
And what can we do to nuance our risk perception of these types of investment opportunities, do you think?
I think we have listed up, or we have a whole list of different issues we've raised with the Norwegian government where they can reduce the risk as we perceive them as investors. And I think it's very useful. That could be paired with the databases of the UN, and each country could choose their own road forward, how they would support the investors. From our perspective, when we did microfinance, as you know, the finance department gave us some guarantee on the currency side, which was very helpful. I don't think on a net basis they paid for anything, but it reduced the risk and how we perceived it. And that's very practical. It increased the amounts we invested, and take that as an example and see how can we apply this in different areas, I think would be very useful.
And yes, yeah. Christian, and then
I was just going to say, maybe we should flip it around when we think about the SDG impact, is to try to find where is there most potential. So rather than talking about measuring and putting something in a box and ranking that within the box, think about where do we have the most potential, where can we create the most value over the next 5, 10, 20, 30, 40 years, and use the SDGs as a guide or an inspiration around that.
So not simply thinking about how sustainable is this particular investment or company, but also thinking about where is the potential for development and impact the greatest, and then mapping those two.
And over time, that should also be the greatest financial impact. Those two should come together, and that should attract capital, hopefully.
Exactly, because that's where the growth will be also, right?
Yeah.
Jan Erik?
I think it's a real danger that, pushing for standardization and too much measurement too early will actually maybe lead us in the wrong direction. The experience, if we look at, based on our 25 years in the business, is that, these simplistic sustainability ratings, it's the large corporates in developed world that are really, successful in communicating, that score well. While maybe there are smaller companies, even in the Nordics, that have a much bigger impact, or companies in the developing world with much bigger impact. So I think initiatives are really valuable in terms of generating ideas and solutions and innovations through more insight. It's very valuable in terms of assessing company risk, but I think it's maybe too early to start, standardizing. I think we need to explore.
So we need to be careful not to reward the organizations with the best reporting and the largest communication teams.
Of course. But that's the one part that is challenging in some of these initiatives, but they're really valuable in the two other dimensions.
Yeah.
But Ylva, I think we can start investing now. I think you know so much already. I mean, when we chose our approach, we said, you know, what will be the most important accelerators for growth in the developing world? And that we found out that access to finance and access to energy were one of those, or two of those areas. We don't have the measurement of every single effect of this, but we feel pretty sure that it's moving it in the right direction, and we can do it right now.
So is there a risk of
So I
kind of
think
waiting
we have
for
to do
perfection?
both. We have to improve the way we report on things, improve the definitions, but still don't let this be the excuse for not doing anything. Yeah. I mean, in the big picture, there's pretty clear what we have to do. So why don't we just start doing that?
Exactly.
And then we can measure it and become better at measuring it and comparing it to each other. But we have to do both. That we have so little time left to make a difference.
Waiting for perfection in terms of understanding impact, we won't actually get anywhere.
It's a waste of time.
I think that deserves an applause. We are now going in for landing, but very quickly from you, Rainer. You're also competing on this, right? You're building a firm that attracts investors and generates returns based on this concept. If everyone has access to the same stuff, is it then not competitive?
I look forward to that moment, because the reason why EQT and also we are thinking about this, which we call private equity 4.0, is that this is a new value creation approach, right? And when the whole industry have moved into this, first of all, we have solved the problems, and we're probably in 2030, and luckily,
that would be great.
You know,
that would be great.
And then there's a new value creation agenda. Yeah. So we'll see what that is, what the private equity 5.0 is. So, but it's fun to actually be part of being in the front of this and having that momentum. But I do look behind my shoulder all the time now, and I see the whole field starting to catch up, which is great. Yeah. Yeah.
And that's what we want.
That's what we want.
We're going to end in a similar way with this panel. One statement from each of you, one action that you will take personally to make this happen. And Rainer, let's kick it off with you.
It will be to show through the performance in our companies that externalities don't come at a cost and as a trade-off of profits, but rather opposite, that is fully correlated. So it's to drive the performance through this strategy and showing that externalities is actually profit.
Great. Externalities is profit. Looking forward to that proof. Sverre?
I'll do my best to see that our investments are in harmony with the SDG goals.
Good. We'll hold you to that.
Yes.
Christian?
I'm going to push for, in this SDG Impact project, to have a really dynamic and relatively simple model, so we don't fall into the trap of reporting and complexity.
Jan-Erik?
Well, we have solutions today, and my personal engagement is to bring more capital into those solutions to create a greater impact.
Thank you so much for that. Thank you also for the commitments that you're making for the future, and good luck on getting it done in practice.
Good luck to all of us.
Now we'll be wrapping up, and in what I hope will be an appropriate segue to some closing reflections from Achim, I'd just like to share a slight rephrasing of a quote from Martin Luther King, which is, "The right time to do the right thing is now."
Well, having just listened to these very amazing speakers' insights and commitments, nothing much to add from my side, but to say this is a moment where each one of us just needs to accept responsibility to lead. And I was listening to the discussion with interest that, is measurement something that can become too complicated? Absolutely. SDG Impact is not trying to become a rating agency. This is very important. This is much simpler and much more complex at the same time. We are trying to help the financial markets to get to grips with something that they constantly invoke as not enabling them to invest in places where investments are needed. And that is, how do you measure impact? Because if you sell impact as part of your competitive advantage, then you have to stand the test of the market and of the public and of those who scrutinize you that you're delivering impact. This is a very focused attempt to break through this glass ceiling for investors, but also for investments. And let us be clear, when we talk about competitive advantage, not only are many beginning to work in this field, we are sitting on trillions of dollars that we're unable to invest in a global financial economy. And that is part of the extraordinarily exciting prospect that I think we are trying to tackle, because if we can unlock the impact equation, so to speak, we can open up enormous opportunities for investment. And I think therein lies the power of what we're trying to do together. And again, to all those who spoke just now, thank you. Thank you for taking a risk. Thank you for starting to act when perfection is not in front of you. That's the heart of business, and we're proud to be partners in that. Thank you very much.